to talk about Beethoven's Symphony number 5 today, and I want to just give you a little bit more information about Beethoven's career. So in total, Beethoven wrote 9 symphonies. The first and second symphony are from his first period, the period that's more classical. Numbers 3 through 8 are second period, middle period. And then number 9 is from his last period. So Beethoven's symphonies, as you can see, he didn't write as many as Mozart or Haydn. They are more personal, they're longer, they're more complex. In general, they're just have a greater sense of emotion. And definitely Beethoven is someone who is very personal in his approach. So these works have a great sense of individuality about them. The third symphony is known as the Eroica. This is the one that Beethoven initially wanted to dedicate to Napoleon. And when he found out that Napoleon had declared himself emperor, then he was disgusted and said he's just going to be another dictator. And he scratched through his name and instead inscribed it to the memory of a heroic person. So that's what heroica means, is heroic. But the idea of artist as hero is something associated with Beethoven, and we see that Beethoven is writing works that are for the sake of art. So, for sure, by the last style period, Beethoven was writing for a future audience. And these works, many of them weren't performed in his lifetime, but he was writing for a future audience that he hoped one day would understand his music. So, in addition to the symphony, Beethoven wrote 32 piano sonatas. These stand at the top of the piano sonata literature. And he wrote 16 string quartets. So those 3 genres of symphony, piano sonata, and string quartet are among his greatest. He also wrote important duo sonatas for violin and piano, so he wrote 10 of those, 5 cello and piano works. He wrote 5 piano concertos, and we'll look at the 4th piano concerto in the next section. And those are works that he actually wrote for himself to perform, so there weren't any that were written in the late period in his last 12 years. And he wrote then various other works of huge mass called the Jesus Solemnis at the end of his life. But the symphony and piano sonatas and string quartets are really, really important. All right, so a couple things about Beethoven. I mentioned the existence of conversation books. And so that's something that's unique to studying Beethoven's career, is the existence of those. Also, he preserved his sketchbooks. And these sketchbooks show his the way that his works evolved over time. And so the Fifth Symphony, you can start to see sketches for the themes of that in 1804. And he completed that in 1807. It was premiered in 1808 in this huge concert that took place in Vienna. So the date of the premiere, the concert that Beethoven put together was this huge, it was like 4-hour long concert. It started with the premiere of his Sixth Symphony, which he was writing at the same time as the Fifth Symphony. It also had 3 movements of a mass that he had just composed. It had the 4th piano concerto, which he was the soloist, and this is one of the last times that he played in public because of his hearing loss. It also had the choral fantasy, which is this very large work for orchestra, choir, and piano soloist. Beethoven then was the soloist in that work. That was the last work of the concert. But at any rate, it was a subscription concert, and one which was very, very successful. So, the Fifth Symphony is in C minor. And there are some things in Beethoven's symphonies that he introduced, that he changed. One of the things that he is using is, instead of having a minuet and trio third movement, Beethoven writes scherzo trio movements. So some of the differences with the scherzo is a faster tempo, and it has more of an emotional element, whether it's in a major key. The term scherzo means joke. So if they were in major keys, they tend to be more comical, light. And if they were in minor keys, they tended to be more dramatic. So, but they're more emotional. So that's one thing that we'll see in this Fifth Symphony, and that's something that Beethoven consistently did. In general, the scherzo is associated with romantic music. The minuet is associated with classical. And so that's one way that you can kind of tell if a composer is more classical or romantic in the way that they're writing for that movement in a symphony. All right, another thing that Beethoven does is to extend the length of the development section. And then he also extends the length of the coda section. So what we'll see in the first movement is that all of the sections are about 125 measures long. And that includes a long coda that's also 125 measures long. And with Beethoven, we'll see that he approaches the coda as a second development section. So he makes a relationship between the development and the coda. So one of the ways that Beethoven is described is Beethoven's described as a great architect of music. So that's something that's a classical characteristic, that's emphasis on form and of having a sense of logic. So it's always important to consider the way that Beethoven organizes material, because you can always find some reason for why things are the way they are, but Beethoven is very innovative and unique in the things that he does with the way that things are organized. All right. Some other things that we'll see in this symphony is that Beethoven lengthens the last movement of the symphony, and that it becomes the movement that resolves all of the conflict that's set into motion at the beginning of the work. And so he's viewing the symphony as something that's more unified. And one of the things that he does in the Fifth Symphony is that he brings back themes in later movements that were initially presented in earlier movements. And so this term, cyclic, is a very important term. So if you see cyclic technique or cyclic form, that has to do with returning themes that occur in later movements of a multi-movement work, a sonata cycle work. And that becomes a really important 19th century technique. That is the basic principle that we'll see with the next work that we do, the Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique, which is based on a theme that represents this character and this story that Berlioz has created. And the term thematic transformation describes the idea of a theme that keeps coming back, but each time it comes back, it's changed to the point that you hardly recognize it until you look closely. But that is something that's also associated with the idea of Wagner's leitmotif, of having certain themes that represent certain characters, and having this vocabulary that unifies a large-scale work. So what we're going to see in the Fifth Symphony is the opening 4 notes of the symphony, the most famous melody in classical music. That is described as the Fate motive, because Beethoven was asked what he had in mind when he wrote this, and the symphony was one of Beethoven's favorite works. He said that that is fate knocking at the door. And so you hear that 3 short notes and a long note. And that is then the basic theme of the symphony that comes back in each movement. And so we're going to be listening to the first, third, and fourth movements. And it's something then that ties together all the movements of that symphony. He didn't really have this technique in the works of Haydn and Mozart. So all right, so that's an important concept in this symphony, to be able to talk about the fate motive and how that links together thematically each of the movements of the symphony. All right, something else that Beethoven does is that he is going to expand the size of the orchestra, and he's going to add new instruments to classical orchestration. So in the last movement of the Fifth Symphony, he adds 3 new instruments to the ensemble. So he adds a piccolo, a contrabassoon, and trombones, 3 trombones. We'll see in the Ninth Symphony that Beethoven even goes to the point of adding a choir and adding the vocal elements. So in the Ninth Symphony, the last movement is a set of theme variations on the Ode to Joy theme. And he writes for choir and for vocal soloists. So that's a trend that's going to continue in the 19th century, is that the orchestra is going to expand in size. So whereas a Mozart symphony would have 40 players, by the time you get to the end of the Romantic period and Mahler is writing his great works, they would call for 125 players. So that's something which Beethoven kind of sets into motion, is this expansion. Basically what it's doing is just allowing for more unique combinations of sounds. So in the next work that we do of Berlioz.